Anytime you talk about tax policy, it kind of revolves around two issues: fairness and the efficiency of the tax system you put in place. Let me start with you, Kevin. A really simple question: is the system we have in place right now fair?
No, it's terrible, I would say. It's terrible both from an efficiency point of view, because there are just so many different taxes, so many different rates. The transaction costs of complying with the tax code are really, really very high. And fairness isn't really so much the issue, but there is a sort of issue of moral corruption, I think, that's invited by our tax code, which is the assumption that the government has a prior lien on all wealth, income, and assets. And when you have a government that has a sort of royalist assumption that whatever you keep at its sufferance, there's no case for making any sort of intellectual limitations on a government like that.
Let me follow up on that. So, and this wasn't always the case, right? I mean, prior to what, the 16th Amendment in 1913, there wasn't so much of an assumption, I guess, that this direct income taxation form that we have today was acceptable. Did you see a big philosophical shift at that point?
Well, it didn't really come until quite a bit later, I don't think. You know, even up until the 20s, 30s, and maybe even into World War II, you know, the top income tax rate was something like 3 or 4%, and you had to be making $800,000 or something like that to pay the top rate. So it was a very focused tax paid by a very, very small number of people. It wasn't the sort of situation you have now where, you know, a middle-class family living in a place like New York or a place like Philadelphia, taxes may actually be their #1 expense.
Well, you actually touched on the progressive nature of it there, but I thought a minute ago you were saying essentially that, you know, the confiscation of taxes in itself was a moral question.
Well, sure it is. I think so. I mean, there are certain things, I mean, if you want to look at it from a sort of libertarian utopia point of view, yeah, all relationships would be voluntary.
Well, Chris, let me ask you, I mean, he kind of touched on, so obviously confiscation. Walter Williams, Professor George Mason, has equated taxation essentially to thievery. The only difference being that if the government's evolved, legality is the only difference. How do you feel about that and what Kevin said?
There's this quote that's on the IRS, which is from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is that taxes are the price we pay for civilization.
And Holmes drew a government paycheck, we might add, though.
I think that's actually a fairly succinct explanation of it. The
taxes
fact of the
are the price we pay for civilization.
The price we pay for civilization. I mean, at the basic philosophical level, look, I mean, you know, there are people who are real extreme libertarians who kind of believe in this sort of anarchic vision of voluntary exchange. Everyone, you know, anyone, you know, to the left of that, you know, there's going to be a state, and that state is going to be funded somehow. Taxes are the means by which we do that, and we enter into a voluntary arrangement through constitutional governance by which we create the state, and that voluntary arrangement through a democratic polity makes decisions about how the state's funded and how we pay for that. So that, I mean,
but surely 19th century America with no income tax wasn't the jungle. It had civilization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not voluntary if I have no say in what those taxes are going to support, and it's immoral because it engenders, as the tax code is today and as it's used, it engenders class warfare. And I'm uncomfortable with that.
What defines class warfare has become this beacon of rhetoric. There have been. Let's talk about class warfare in the history.
I'm glad you said that.
In the history of human civilization, there have been class warfare. There has been class warfare. People lined up against the wall and shot. Right. Terrible purges, horrible violence.
French Revolution stuff we're talking here.
Well, French Revolution. I mean,
but you made your point.
The Long March. Yeah, right.
I mean, we don't need to bring out, you know, resurrect one of the French or bring them back to show that there was class warfare.
But to use the term class warfare is the reason that it has rhetorical force is to incite people to think of those examples and compare that to a top marginal tax rate of 25%. My point being, the rhetorical distance and conceptual philosophical difference from setting a marginal tax rate at 25% or 32% to people's blood running in the streets is so far as to be meaningless.
Well, true, there's a difference between lining people up against the wall and shooting them and lining up against the wall and robbing them.
Exactly.
But it's not entirely different thing.
Let me jump in.
I think it's a hugely different thing.
When you say the top earners are cast in such a way as to make them seem to have an unfair advantage for whatever reason that they've been able to earn X amount of dollars, juxtaposed to those that are paying little or no taxes, that's immoral. And that's a tax code. That's a tax code run amok. That's immoral, and it is also causing class division, class strife.
But invocation of morality to justify the idea that taxing people is theft is, to me, ludicrous. We have a, to me, we have a social. The invocation
of immorality is. The tax system is. I'm sorry, I missed that.
To say that the tax system is robbing, is thievery, which is what Kevin said, well, I think is ridiculous.
It is thievery if I don't have a choice.
Well, no, you do have a choice.
I pay taxes under constraint.
We have a democratic government. We create a social contract with each other. We have a social contract with each other that says, in order for us to live together as a society, we need to have certain things. The definition of what those things are that constitute a reasonable social contract, you can argue over that.
Chris, you made a point, and Miles actually seconded you here, and that is that by even entering into this society, being part of it, we essentially have invoked ourselves with this social contract theory.
Right.
Tell me about that. I mean, have we really, I mean, voluntary requires somebody that has a voluntary, it's a voluntary give and take. Has that happened with everyone in regards to the tax system? Mychal points out it's a system of compulsion. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's not. I would say it's a system of law. Every law can be defined as a compulsion. But if you can't murder someone and you have to pay taxes, and I think those are all reasonable things. We have to pay taxes if we want to have public education for our children, a reasonable health care system, an infrastructure that's not crumbling, and I would argue very much strongly that class warfare, saying that the fact that we're more unequal now than we have been in any year in the United States since 1929, that's not class warfare. That's an objective reality, which I think is tearing at the fabric of our country, and we better do something about it, and soon.
But that begs the argument then that everyone should be on an equal footing. Everyone will not be on an equal footing.
It's also a question of what sort of inequality, I think. I mean, the inequality in 1929 included people who were starving to death.
Exactly.
Which it doesn't anymore. I mean,
it doesn't anymore because we pay taxes. That's exactly right.
No,
You're
I
exactly
so,
right about
actually.
that. We've actually created a floor for people through the social welfare state that was created by taxation.
Well, the government stepped in and said it's unacceptable that people die in the street for hunger.
Exactly.
And the government is stepping in now to say
the thing
it's
that's really
unacceptable that
changed the
people lose
standard
their
of
life
living much
savings.
more than anything else has been any sort of New Deal health programs. It's been just the general rising standard of living from our economy. It's been the economy that's brought everything else up with it. I mean, certainly there are things the government can do in terms of providing certain sorts of social safety net things. Sometimes they do a good job with it, sometimes they don't. I look at the government schools, for instance, and I don't want those people in charge of the healthcare system, at least any healthcare system that I'm going to use, or the roads, or almost anything else that you can think.
We should distinguish a few issues here. Okay, first of all, the notion of taxes as necessarily and de facto immoral and confiscatory, right? But let's
confiscatory, yes.
Yeah.
Who can argue that?
Well, okay, but
you're not arguing that it isn't, that the tax system isn't confiscatory.
But there are certain kinds of confiscation that are easier to swallow than others.
Okay. Let's say that. But the point is that if the reasoning goes confiscatory, ergo immoral, right? We are dealing with a very I just want to lay on the table. We're dealing with a truly radical vision. Okay. If that's
give me the response then. If that's the radical vision, give me your point of view on that.
Well, the response is Miles, which is that we do all sorts of things as a self-governing polity that are compulsory, and taxes are one of them. So, for instance, I cannot drive, 180 miles an hour. I can't, go around breaking windows. There's all sorts of things.
But they're not your windows. But your dollars are your dollars.
What's that?
They're not your windows. That's why it's a crime to break a window, because it's not yours.
So, but then if we're going to really move to real philosophical bedrock, right? Then we get into what private property is, etc. Right?
But it's not that radical a vision. I mean, there was no income tax contemplated in the Constitution.
Yeah, but the Constitution. Can we just say though, the Constitution of 1783 didn't envision a lot of things, right? I mean, right?
But to that point,
and most of the things it didn't envision that we now have, we probably
shouldn't
have.
have. Exactly.